All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be part two of talking about the neighbors here of Brazil. And so we're going to get into Uruguay, Paraguay, the Surinames, and then Venezuela. And so if you haven't watched part one on Argentina, for my students, please make sure you check that out as well. But we're going to start things off with Uruguay, which is about 3.4 million people, so among some of the smaller nations when it comes to population in South America. They have a pretty mild climate, which makes sense given their relative location in South America. They're also kind of defined by their rolling plains and their grasslands. Much like Argentina, Uruguay is very well known for its beef production. It became independent from Spain in 1828. Its capital city is Montevideo, and it's a mostly European, or it's people mostly of European ancestry. There is certainly native populations, but this is a nation that predominantly has a lot of influence from European, and a lot of its people are of European ancestry. The production and the raising of sheep and cattle outnumber people 10 to 1. Given the landscape, it makes sense because the quality of the land for ranching is very productive. And so in many ways, this nation actually prospers out of it because they enjoy one of the highest standards of living in all of South America. Paraguay, getting on to our other countries here, the Gran Chaco is this great forested area that covers about the western 2/3 of the nation. And so certainly forestry is going to be a big part of the economy here in Paraguay. Wars have definitely devastated Paraguay, and farming has definitely both of them definitely dominate the economy today. So forestry and farming probably are two biggest. However, one of the other things that's really cool about Paraguay is that they actually export part of their electricity production because they utilize the hydroelectric dams on the Paraná River, and so they are able to produce more than they need, and so they sell that to countries around them. And so a great example of a nation utilizing natural resources for energy production and able to give those to other countries around them. And then, of course, capital here in Paraguay is Asuncion. Shifting gears to Venezuela, you'll find that in Venezuela, as far as the physical landscape goes, in the north, you'll find the largest lake in South America, which is Lake Maracaibo. It's surrounded by marshes and swamps, and you don't tend to see a lot of people living here because the conditions aren't ideal for agriculture, and of course, building on marshland is quite challenging. Oil wells definitely dominate the landscape here in Venezuela as a whole, but certainly also in the north. Venezuela has more oil reserves than any other country in the Americas, and they're up there as far as oil production in the world. Caracas is the capital. It's the largest city as well, about 2.8 million people, so a little bit smaller than some of the other cities we've talked about, say like Buenos Aires or Rio de Janeiro, or even some of the other cities that we've talked about. The Llanos lie in the eastern part of Venezuela. These are your grassy plains. You'll see a lot of ranches, a lot of farms, and again, a lot of oil wells here as well. The Orinoco River helps to provide electricity to this country. So much like we saw in Paraguay, they're able to utilize some of those natural resources for oil production. One of the really cool pieces of physical geography that you'll see in Venezuela is something called Angel Falls or Angel Falls. It's called this because it was believed that only angels could survive the drop. It's the tallest waterfall in the world. It's over 3,200 feet high, and so highly encourage you to check out the video here or go and search for it, because it's not only is it beautiful, but it's this amazing experience. In fact, some of the water evaporates before it hits the bottom. Climate here is mostly tropical, and altitude does play a role in the highlands. Economically, One of the challenges that Venezuela has is they've put so many of their economic chips into one industry, and that's oil, and that has proven to be hurting them. They are trying to diversify their economy, but they're still feeling some of the effects. Because they're a world leader in the production of petroleum, they did put a lot of their hope economically and their production into that singular industry. And again, that has hurt them economically. It is owned by the state and operated by the state, and many, many people are still employed in the oil industries. It's got some of the cheapest gas in the world, if not the cheapest gas. It about averages around the equivalent of 5 US cents per gallon. Factories here also make steel, chemicals, and food production, so this is also part of the attempt of trying to diversify the economy a little bit more. There's additional mineral resources here, including iron ore, bauxite, certainly limestone, gold, and diamonds, as well as emeralds are also mined here. And about 10% of the people are involved in agriculture. So one of the challenges here is because of the lack of agricultural development is that actually Venezuela has to import a lot of their food. And given some of the unrest that currently exists in Venezuela and possible transitions for the government, that has created many challenges for Venezuela. As far as its history, it's a Spanish colony in the late 1500s, so the late 16th century. Gets its name meaning Little Venice, and so certainly some connections to even perhaps the ideas of Italy. Simón Bolívar, he led a revolution in Venezuela from Spain in 1830, and after that it was governed by caudillos for most of the 1800s and the 1900s, and since then has become more of a socialist nation as far as its economy as well as its government. Shifting gears here to the Guyanas, or the Guianas. These include the nations of Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. So as far as Guyana goes, this is a British colony at a time it won its independence in the 1960s, and really since then has struggled economically. It's struggled to kind of gain a foothold, but part of that is because it's a very young country. And in fact, in some ways, Guyana sees some of the same impacts of colonization as, say, some of the nations in Africa do, as far as being a young country and developing and seeing some of those effects of having so much of their mineral resources kind of stripped away from them. It's very tropical. It's covered in thick rainforests. And so part of the tourism attraction here in Guyana are those rainforests for sure. Most people do live in the lowland coastal plains, though. Living in the rainforest is a challenge and certainly has its isolation to it as well. The United Kingdom did take control of the area from the Netherlands, and at that time they outlawed slavery. And so as a result of that British takeover, you've also seen an increasing number of people come from India, which used to be a colony of Britain as well. They moved into the area, and they had a large influence on the culture. And so you'll see some of that Indian tradition, certainly still some of that English and Dutch tradition, along, of course, with its native populations. Moving on to Suriname. This area was settled first by the British and then by the Dutch. It became independent in 1975, so it's still a relatively young country. It's a mix of those mostly from Africa, Indonesia, and India. And given, the maritime tradition of the Dutch, that certainly makes sense that they would have such a wide variety, including the British influence there as well, certainly with India. As far as religions here, you'll see Christianity, you'll see Hinduism, and Islam. They're all practiced here. However, most people do speak Dutch. That will be the predominant language that you'll still hear. And then lastly, French Guiana. This is a colony of France. It became a colony of France in the 1600s, so the 17th century. It's actually still a French colony today. In fact, the government is led by a French official known as the prefect, or the prefect if you prefer. Most people here are a mix of African they're either of African descent or they're a mix of African and European. Definitely a very French tradition here. French is, of course, the primary language, and the predominant religion is Roman Catholicism. And the currency here, much like it is in France, continues to be the euro. All right, check out that check-in quiz here if you want to just make sure you're picking up on some of the ideas. And again, this covers some of the ideas from the first video as well as the second video. For my students, hopefully you've been following along with the guided notes. Ask me any questions that you might have. For those of you who are just listening, I hope that we could kind of increase some of your understanding of the countries between Argentina and Venezuela. That's going to do it for this edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.